Why do I bring that up? Well, right now we can assume that there's a little bit of a static understanding of space warfare because I would argue that we're in the balloon versus the airplane mentality in space warfare. In World War I, air power really came into its own. But it was actually the airplane in World War I. Air power had been a part of warfare since the 1700s in the idea of balloons. But balloons and even zeppelins were not really capable of good movement and maneuver. Therefore, there is no record of air warfare between balloons, ever. Air warfare required airplanes. So why do I bring that up? Well, because satellites are essentially balloons in space. Limited maneuverability, limited potential for engagements. Next slide. But it turns out that might not be the case for much longer. I would argue that between satellites, physical destruction by space warfare or attacking in space is very, very highly questionable as something that is going to happen very often. Why? Because it's hard to move, it's very expensive to move, it's almost impossible to maneuver tactically, and it's extremely expensive. And I would argue that if you're going to fight satellites between satellites, both satellites will lose because both will run out of gas. So maybe we need spacecraft before we really see space warfare. That would definitely be a dynamic approach to the space environment, a big change. Next slide. But I'm in Central Texas right now, just outside of Austin, and a little bit south of here, which is way, hours and hours, but pretty close by Texas standards. They're building and flying the SpaceX Starship, which is supposed to be a refuelable maneuver vehicle in space that is allowed very dynamic, a lot of payload capability, a lot of maneuver in space, a lot of movement. So with this development, you might be seeing the space version of an airplane. And if that's the case, you're about to see a big change of space warfare or military space operations in general, going from very static to very dynamic. From an understanding of a static strategic stability as being all important, that is extremely irritating. So in order to adapt correctly, we might need to understand that space warfare or space power theory might say that this is actually a good thing, not necessarily a bad thing. Next slide. So that's a picture of what the Starship is supposed to do once it actually starts flying operationally after a couple of years. It's supposed to land, astronauts as part of the NASA Artemis program, and then later, whoever wants to get out there on the moon. That's something that we don't do today. But if you think about warfare in that aspect, is that really, even if there's attacks and fights between objects such as those, is that as dangerous as a, say, Chinese ballistic or a Chinese anti-satellite missile taking out a Milstar nuclear communications satellite or a very important NRO satellite? I would argue no, even though that is far more science fiction-y and might even involve more people dying actually on orbit. But if space power theory suggests that space warfare is limited war, you have to be wary of escalating too quickly as a knee-jerk reaction because it happened in space. Okay? Because space power theory would say dynamism in the domain is how you maintain the ability to deter in space. So I would argue that space power theory, a la Klein, is a better foundation for space warfare analysis and sounder space deterrence policy. Next slide. And I'm going to try to go, I'm going a little over, sorry, I'm almost done. However, there is a time where the sanctuary school applies, and that is if you think about naval warfare again. Sea warfare, even today, if you have a ship-on-ship combat in the South China Sea, let's say, and one rams each other, that's bad, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to escalate the situation right away. However, if the Chinese took down an American ballistic missile submarine, all of a sudden that becomes way worse. Not because that was a sea battle in a ship, it's because it was a nuclear capable ship. It's important for nuclear deterrence. So if you, next slide, if you think about the same way, if you have a spacecraft that's being attacked that is critical to nuclear deterrence, sorry, that was a cheap build to add some yellow to the bottom. If you have a space attack that is against something that is critical for American nuclear deterrence, that could be something that is escalatory. But you have to view that as judge the repercussions of that attack based on what was attacked, not where it was when it was attacked. All right, so next slide. And I'm sorry I took a little bit too much time, but my conclusion is basically, hey, when you think about space warfare, don't necessarily think that it is a highly escalatory, highly provocative situation just because it's in space. It might be, just because it is in space would tend to suggest that it's not as bad as someone dying on the ground or something else. So if you go in, if you're an analyst, or you're trying to be you're a commander, or you're an advisor to a commander, if it's a space attack, if that's all it is, advocate caution and a collective deep breath, because space warfare is generally limited in scope. But if the space asset is critical to something on the ground, like nuclear deterrence, view it as an attack on your deterrence ability, not your space ability, to determine what you should do in terms of escalation. Because the most important thing that we need to do right now in space, in this new era of dynamic space operations, is to resist overreaction for military conflict that may occur there in the future. And with that, I'm sorry, I'm a little bit over, but that is all I have.